Maybe I'll kick us off. First of all, thanks to everyone for joining us here for this virtual session. My name is Jeremy Keys. I'm at Villanova. I'm co-editor-in-chief for the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. My co-editor here, Beth Vallon, is on as well. And it's our distinct pleasure to host this session on the Kinnear Award. And so what I'd like to do is maybe just kick it off with just a little bit of brief background about the Kinnear Award. So beginning in 1993, the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing Editorial Review Board started identifying one article per year that made a lasting contribution to the area of marketing and public policy. In 2001, the award was renamed to honor Thomas Kinnear in recognition of his exceptional service to the marketing discipline. Tom was instrumental in establishing the journal and served as its first editor. Today, the award recognizes an article in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing that makes a significant contribution to the understanding of marketing and public policy issues within the recent 3-year time period, and is intended to encourage high-quality academic research in the field of public policy and marketing. I don't see Tom on the call. Tom was going to jump in and talk a little bit about the history of the award and the history of the journal. So we will kind of skip that portion of the program. If Tom joins us in a few minutes, maybe he can jump in. So with that, what's really interesting about this exceptional paper is that the idea came out of a Transformative Consumer Research Conference, and so that's a conference that the journal and the AMA has had such a great relationship over the years. So maybe I will pass it on to Martin. Martin, would you mind talking just a bit about your perspective on TCR, the history of this paper, and how TCR has kind of contributed to the development of this paper and others, and your thoughts about TCR and the intersection with Journal of Public Policy and Marketing.
Of course, it will be my pleasure, and I hope you can hear me and see me. Awesome. Yeah, it is a great pleasure to be here and to celebrate this paper, which I clearly love because it says there, love it. And of course, I already sent my heartfelt congratulations to the entire team. It is my pleasure to be here. My name is Martin Mende. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the TCR advisory committee to ACR. So it's the Transformative Consumer Research community that I have the honor of representing. And of course, many of you are part of that community. So yeah, before we get even more explicit in celebrating this, we have to travel in time a little bit, right? Because when we were all young spring chickens in 2019, Maura and I had the pleasure and honor of hosting the TCR conference in Florida. And we used the format that had been successfully established before, where we had tracks 1, 2, and 3. Track 1 was the groups that find themselves together with completely fresh ideas and teams. And track 2 brings in teams that have been working together on an idea for a while and that come in as established teams to continue and maybe focus a little more than it is normally possible for us as we juggle all the other things in our life, to have a few days to sit in a room and just hammer out an idea that they are passionate about. And see, you see on the website, right? It's like, this is the seed that started it when you guys, Sonia and team, proposed the track that was called Operationalizing Critical Race Theory in a Marketplace Context, which is, very close to the ultimate title of the paper. And it was led by Sonia, our dear Jerry, and Sonia. But it was, of course, other wonderful people, some of whom are here, Les, Kevin, Jess. It was just a great team. And I want to also point to the combination, I think. It's a diverse team on some very important aspects. It's large universities, smaller universities, North American, outside of North America. And it brings together also the practitioner element, right? I mean, it's the non-academic stakeholder that is part of this team. And at TCR, we are very privileged to have an anonymous donor that contributes considerable financial resources so that TCR conferences can provide grants to invite non-academic stakeholders. And I've seen it in my own experience, and I would hope that most teams have this experience. It's incredibly enriching when you have people who are non-academics in the broadest sense join the discussion, join the discourse, and just democratically contribute to the discussion. So I have proof that, you know, they also were there working hard, and that's a combination of having fun and also like racking your brain and hitting your brain against the wall until the wall gives in, right? I find it amazing to see, you know, when I remember distinctly walking into your room that morning, and you were already off to the start with all the papers on the wall and like engaging in like very rigorous and passionate discussion, but it was really inspiring to see. And Sonia, I apologize for the AC that seems to have been cold. I vicariously feel bad when I see you sitting there with the blankie on. But I hope it was still a good experience, and we all enjoyed this coming together in Florida. Then after the conference, of course, I'm very grateful that you decided to submit the paper to the special issue. And as you know, well, as you may or may not know, the TCR conference is typically linked to a special issue. And we were very lucky at the time. Scott, Josh, and Pam, as the editors, had allowed us to link our TCR conference to a special issue in, of course, one of our favorite journals, JPP&M. And they gave us the freedom to say, yeah, solicit submissions, and we give you up to a full issue. And we had a lot of submissions, a lot of positive energy after the conference. And one of them was your submission. And I thought I'll lay out a little bit of the journey. Of course, this was there. I looked for like, oh, maybe there's drama or something. There was no drama. It was just a drama-free paper. The reviewers, and I went back to reading the reviews again. One of the reviewers said, I am 100% sold on the importance of this paper. First round, right? So, I mean, I think we all wish, like, at least, could we please have one of those reviewers? And I think it's not just a lucky coincidence. It is because this paper, and I put the timeline up there, this was fall 2019, right? And maybe many of us already understood the importance of the paper. But if anything, sadly, on some level, the history really showed us how important and how vital it was to bring this perspective of critical race theory into marketing and into our discipline, and to have an honest lens into that there are dynamics in the marketplace that some of us don't experience, are not exposed to, are not vulnerable to, and we need stronger and louder voices in understanding this perspective. And I mean, really, over the 3 rounds, the paper, I do believe the review process worked in this instance particularly well. The paper became even better, but really by only tweaking 2 things. One was the advice from the review team was, can you maybe make even more salient the link between critical race theory and its applications in marketing? And can we further emphasize the link to implications for future research, right? Because hopefully this can be the impetus of a sustained stream of literature and research in our field. And those were really the two big bullet points. And the team was very responsive in coming back. And that's why it was not surprising that we're done after 2 rounds and in the fall of 2020. And that was the historic summer of 2020. We were able to conditionally accept this paper. So, I mean, it was a pleasure to serve as the guest editor on this paper. It was enriching and inspiring to see how author and reviewer team work together to create a truly, truly exceptional paper. And so with that, I wanna say I truly love it. It's one of those papers where you're like, man, this needs to be in my reading list for my doctoral seminar. I also congratulate the authors, of course, on the idea, on working through it, working through the successful review process. But I also think, other than congratulations and saying, I love it, I think it is important to also say thank you to the entire team. Thank you not only for being part of the conference, thank you not only for submitting the paper to the special issue, but thank you for being so courageous. This is only topic. And as we know, there are voices who want to suppress specifically this theory. So thank you for being courageous. Thank you for being trailblazers that inspire young scholars, but not only young scholars. I am inspired by you and by your team and by your work. And I personally believe that you, as the scholars you are, and your work makes us and makes our discipline better. So thank you and congratulations.
I think with that, we're ready for the co-author team to present their work.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Martin. I really appreciate that introduction. And I mean, we are honored. We are honored to be recognized in this way. And I don't think we had any idea that it would gain this kind of momentum and attention. And so we're really, really happy with the response to our paper. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay. All right. Thanks for the thumbs up. All right. All right, so I'm Sonia Martin-Poole, the other Sonia, and I just want to first give a shout out to my co-authors on this paper, Sonia, Kevin, Francesca, Akan, Les, Lynn, Melinda, and the late, great Geraldine Rosa Henderson. These brilliant scholars are my partners for this research, and I'm grateful to have worked with them. We're all part of the RIM, Race in the Marketplace network. And this is an international transdisciplinary research network with a mission to produce knowledge on the historic, contemporary, and future interactions of race in the marketplace through scholarship and practice. I'm presenting today on this paper, but they are equal contributors. And since many of them are here today, I would love to open it. When we open it for questions, they can answer the questions and contribute to the dialogue today. So I want to give you a little bit more around the origin story for the paper. It began as a Facebook page called Race in the Marketplace. And Sonia Greer created the page and liberally invited folks across institutions and disciplines to post examples on the page of the ways in which race was implicated in the marketplace, right? To provide those examples. And what resulted was a overwhelming response, first of all, of people posting, but also a collection of hundreds, now thousands of news stories, narratives, analyses, and commentaries. And in just a little over a year, I would say the RIM Facebook page had become such a rich source of marketplace data. And as we reviewed the posts that had accumulated over the years, we noticed patterns that demonstrated that race seems built into the functioning and ideological underpinnings of marketplace actions. And to those of us who consider ourselves transformative scholars, marketing and public policy scholars, something else had really become apparent as we were looking through this data. Even though it was clear from the post and literature from other fields that race is integral to our institutions and operations, it remained untheorized in marketing scholarship. And we thought, how can we ever effectively address racial and other types of social inequality in the marketplace if within our own field, we hadn't even acknowledged the ways that to the functioning of the marketplace itself contributes to racial and other kinds of oppression. So in 2018, when Mara and Martin sent out the call for proposals for TCR, we saw it as an opportunity to gather as a group, in person, to work on identifying a framework for marketing that describes the role and race, a role of race in markets. And doing this, we believe that we would lay a foundation for further research and public policy and lead to a more equitable version of the marketplace than what currently exists. So the gathering at TCR happened with the scholars I named earlier. And in May of 2019, that we gathered. And then fast forward a year and a half later, the paper Operationalizing Critical Race Theory in the Marketplace was published, right? So it was a very quick process, but very intense. And we're grateful for our origins, and thanks to Facebook. So let's let's be honest. Too many people still believe that when we're talking about race, we're talking about racism, right? And this is generally what many think about when they think about racism. Jim Crow, legalized racial segregation of neighborhoods, schools, public spaces, the KKK, people of color being brutalized, tortured, and killed without consequence. They even will concede that this kind of racism still exists well beyond the Jim Crow era, right? And these images portray how it shows up: white supremacists and white nationalists carrying tiki torches, Nazi flags and salutes and chants of "you will not replace us." And in marketing, it seems to be no different. The way that race has been acknowledged to have any significance in the marketplace is in the obvious ways. This is a snapshot of a local news story about a Cleveland clothing company that was shut down after they were evicted by the management of the Great Lakes Mall for selling T-shirts with white supremacist taglines and racial slurs printed on them. Most of us here are aware that though the whites only signs are no longer visibly posted, and Jim Crow is no longer a thing, our society is still plagued by racist individuals and groups that maintain attitudes, rhetoric, and behavior of white supremacy. For sure. The kind of racism in these images show the ugly side of people, one based on inequity, exclusion, division, dehumanization, and hate. But the existence of race in the marketplace, we argue, is a lot more complicated than that. And we know that racism is much more than the existence of individual racists or groups of racist people. And we also know that strategies to address individual racism are not sufficient for addressing racial inequity. So that is, at the end of the day, when you put the tiki torches away, when you remove the Nazi armbands and cover up the swastika tattoos, we're still left with long-standing inequitable practices, policies, and structures that affect people of color every day because racism is pervasive. So racism and the construct of race itself takes many forms. I want you to take a look at this framework, and this is modeled here by the National Equity Project, which I often use as a primer to all my talks on race. It unpacks different types of oppression that are often interacting and operating simultaneously. I realize for many of us, this is a review, but it bears repeating, right? It shows how systematic oppression is modeled, or sort of is framed here. And so systematic oppression or racism includes individual racism, which also includes internalized racism. interpersonal racism, which occurs between individuals, both within and across difference, institutional racism, which occurs within institution. This typically involves the unjust policies, practices, procedures, and outcomes at the organizational level that work better for white people than for people of color, whether intentional or not. And then you have structural racism, which represents racial inequalities across institutions, policies, social structures, history, and culture. And it's structural racism that highlights how racism operates as a system of power with multiple interconnected, reinforcing, and self-perpetuating components, which result in racial inequities across indicators for success. So structural racism is the racial inequity that is deeply rooted and embedded in our history, in our culture, and our economic, political, and justice systems. And a manifestation of structural racism is the racial wealth gap, right? Where whites have many times the wealth of people of color, resulting from the history and current reality of institutional racism in multiple systems. The systemic racism recipe includes forces that are institutional structure and interpersonal in nature. And it seems to be the most persistent, what seems to be the most persistent within that framework is structural racism. And it's most persistent, it's what creates the disparities in many of our success indicators that we identify as markets, right? Not only the economy, but criminal justice system, employment, housing, healthcare, politics, and education. This is the racism that prevents or makes it more challenging for people of color to participate in society and in the economy. And while systemic racism manifests itself into what appears to be separate institutions, factors like housing insecurity, the racial wealth gap, education, policing, and wellness are intimately connected. I show this framework because distinguishing between these interconnecting forces help us focus needed and distinct attention, analysis, and strategies on institutional and structural racism. It points toward needed systemic change-focused strategies. These are strategies which address root causes and can result in more transformative and lasting change. I want to point out there's no doubt that we need to address all forms of racism, but what this framework shows us is that strategies to address individual racism are not sufficient for dismantling structural racism. So our paper calls on marketing researchers, educators, policymakers, and practitioners to employ theories, frameworks, and methods that center race throughout the marketing process and research on places and spaces. These frameworks, theories, and methods need to capture the structural elements of social challenges that impinge on people's lived marketplace experiences and behavior, including social stratification, social structure, history, power, privilege, all relevant to explaining our current day inequities. In marketing research and practice, what we have been doing regarding race is focusing primarily on representation. That is, who is depicted in marketing, who is targeted, and what we call on research to do, and practitioners too, to do, is to move the focus beyond the representational level of who is depicted, who is targeted, and move toward involving a historical contextualization, right? A reflection on racist and colonial histories. So our aim was twofold, to provoke additional thought and research related to race in the marketplace, and to also stimulate thinking about the ways research on race can be transformed and leveraged to foster marketplace equity and consumer well-being. And that's where critical race theory comes in, right? If you can see the value of the framework described on the previous slide, then you have already a CRT perspective. And because CRT is simply defined as a racial lens that identifies racism and its intersectionalities as central to American attitudes and institutions, rather than a matter of bad behavior by individual racists. So CRT started with legal scholars. It was contemporary discourses on race and racism and many other fields of study draw on CRT, but marketing and marketplace research has not really seen analogous engagement. And this oversight exists despite the theory's apparent overlap with the TCR movement. In this paper, we define CRT's 6 key tenets. We did not create those tenets. Those tenets were created by other people, mostly legal scholars before us. And they're shown all together on this slide. But what we did, we described how they show up, or they may show up in marketing research and practice. And once we define and describe CRT, we then go on to describe how it shows up and compare the traditional mainstream perspectives to the transformational or transformative CRT perspectives within the marketing domain. So the first CRT tenet is social justice. And in the marketing context, we use the phrase social justice to signify fairness, equity, and equality in distributions, procedures, and interactions related to marketing scholarship, practice, and pedagogy. If we were to take a traditional perspective, then that means that we would assume neutral objectives, neutral research goals, and a neutral orientation. An example of this would be when we see corporate apologies for racist behavior framed as an incident of an isolated problem in the organization. But a transformative CRT perspective involves equity, fairness, equality as key goals, and the research that is action-oriented. An example of this is when racist incidents are viewed as reflective of structural racism that needs to be confronted using specific action steps. As we saw Starbucks do after a racist incident in one of their stores, right? They didn't just issue an apology, they committed to and took measurable steps to deal with the problem with anti-racist training of all their employees. And I want you to compare this to Home Depot, which simply issued an apology, right? And then chalked it up to a few bad apples that they fired. The second CRT tenet is the centrality and permanence of racism. And that is that there is an acknowledgement of race as a social construct that invokes hierarchical power and serves to distribute and restrict privilege between racialized bodies. Thus, racism is not the sum of prejudicial actions and individual attitudes, but a state of mind embedded in our psyches, culture, systems, and institutions. Moreover, racism and racialized incidents are experiences that affect all members of a society, regardless of racial affiliation or identification. And CRT extends the construct of racism to include the myriad of ways in which whiteness is centered, normalized, and privileged, taken for granted in social structures, formal and informal policies, and cultural practices. If we were to take a traditional perspective, comparing behaviors and attitudes across racialized groups based on dominant societal norms is what happens, right? It sets a standard or deems some arbitrary criteria as important, so as to determine whether someone is worthy of privileges. An example of this is comparing behaviors and choices or outcomes of people of color with those of white people, positioning white people as the baseline standard. This is what happens when we perpetuate the myth of the model minority, which is stereotyping Asian Americans as studious, successful, and smart. A model minority who excel in education and accomplish the American dream. We know that despite its positive overtones, this stereotype is actually damaging for Asian Americans and other students of color. And the model minority myth pits students of color against each other, ignores the reality of systemic racism that Asian Americans continue to encounter. If we were to take a transformative CRT perspective, it involves naming and challenging white supremacy, right? And manifestations of that in the marketplace. It means acknowledging the structural underpinnings of racial hierarchies and the colonial legacies that have shaped contemporary marketplace activities. When we debunk the model minority myth, we are taking a transformative approach. And other examples include critiques, instances of Blackface, right, in consumer culture, and outlining its roots in centuries of anti-Black racism. So what I show here on the right side is another example in advertising. This was a campaign called Kinder Conditions, and the purpose was to bring to light issues with racism and sexism in the marketing industry. And the campaign involved a multimedia campaign that ran across television, radio, newspapers, and billboards. And it highlights the issues with the lack of diversity in advertising, the racial stereotype often being portrayed on screen, and the unrealistic portrayal of women seen in ads. And this was accomplished through videos and posters that had really provocative titles, such as this ad is for white people only. Another was, if you're a woman, don't bother reading this, right? So in research, what happens is traditionally white people are often used as a comparison or control group necessary to decipher the importance of the findings from research on an ethnic minority group. White people have traditionally been considered the control group by which an understanding of minorities is gained from observing those differences. And so there are, inherent differences with that sort of traditional perspective. And CRT is the framework that highlights those problems. The third tenet is the challenge to dominant ideology. So if we're undertaking marketplace studies with a CRT lens, then what we're doing is we're challenging dominant ideological concepts such as neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy as a means to address inequities resulting from racism. These ideological concepts are used to reinforce the realities of white privilege and whiteness. In examining existing power structures, CRT-based approaches emphasize that ideological claims are ways in which the privileged group camouflage their interests to maintain the status quo. CRT also recognizes that dominant ideologies support ignorance of the inequalities that systemic and institutional racism supports and perpetuates. So the traditional perspective, our mainstream perspective, often treats racial inequality as an aberration rather than a natural byproduct of a system of racial domination. And the traditional approach seeks commonalities, right? Across cultural groups, arbitrarily deems certain commonalities as important, or it upholds such findings as the ideological standards of beliefs, practices, and norms. And so examples of this, right, are brands that maintain a privileged idea of Eurocentric tastes, preferences, and features, as standards of beauty, patronage, and product design. A transformative perspective seeks to challenge white supremacy and racial power and to shine light on how the policies, laws, media, what have you, perpetuate and maintain racial power over time. It involves reflexive consideration of how different subjectivities shape research and practice. As the example of this is in action is when there is recognition, analysis, and challenge to the normativity of white identities and how they influence marketplace relations and marketplace studies, as L'Oreal has done in this ad. The fourth tenet is the centrality of experiential knowledge. And critical race theory acknowledges knowledge inherent to the lived experiences of those who are subject to structural racism. And this knowledge is reflected primarily in storytelling and counter-storytelling. The experiential knowledge tenet serves to uplift and centralize the lived experience of people of color as a legit source of knowledge production. This is unlike mainstream scholarship, where knowledge production is the sole domain of academics. The underpinning here is lived experiences of people of color are paramount to examining and countering power-laden beliefs of the dominant majority mindset. So a traditional perspective segments and prioritizes consumer groups in the market to minimize use of resources and maximize results. An example would be a focus on the selective valorization of the lived experiences of typically white middle-class consumers. Transformative perspectives critique central and taken for granted marketing practices. The ones that don't consider diversity of consumers' lived experiences. So this is a snapshot on the right side, a snapshot of one of Procter & Gamble's ads in their The Talk campaign, which showed how Black parents have discussed racism with their children over several decades. We see in the fifth tenet, the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary tenet as being the most applicable in research and market research. And underpinning this tenet is the integration of a variety of fields to analytically make sense of society's racial dynamics at any given moment in time. So a traditional approach would be the utilization of two or more academic disciplines or professional specializations, typically marketing in combination with economics, sociology, or psychology, to solve specific marketing problems. So an example in the research is research on obesity, which typically integrates consumer research on food attitudes and preferences with a psychological framework to understand food choices and eating behavior without reference to their actualized nature of food distribution and the influence of differential media use and exposure to food marketing. Traditional perspectives would support an issue-focused research practice that follows responsive, iterative methodologies, goes beyond the interdisciplinary so that two or more disciplinary approaches transcend one another to form a new holistic approach. The outcome will be completely different than what one would expect from the addition of the parts. So intersectionality is the next one. And the term intersectionality was coined by a Black female legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, when she revealed how the law failed to protect Black women. Black women, she argued, experience discrimination differently than their Black male counterparts, as well as their white female counterparts, incurring what she coined an intersectional oppression. So an intersectionality perspective studies what practices, norms, and systems can magnify oppressions versus privileges for those who have overlapping identity categories. For example, gender, ethnicity, race, and class. And its goal is to find ways to change these problematic practices, norms, and behaviors. The underpinning of this tenet is the recognition of the intersecting nature and impact of structural oppression and histories of subjugation. So in a traditional perspective, there's a treatment of marginalized groups as unidimensional, right? A single context, such as race or gender, is examined. And this results in a quantitative treatment of variables. It focuses on single characteristics, erasing completely understanding of disadvantage to particular groups. A transformative perspective centers race and racism and as an analytical focal point, while recognizing other identity coordinates from which experiences of privilege and oppression emerge, such as gender, class, and sexuality. For example, we could do a study attempting to understand the nuanced advantage of specific intersections, such as white, male, and heterosexual identities. So those were all the tenets. And to further illustrate the value of using a CRT lens and the tenets to explore marketplace actions and protocol, we applied CRT to the development and utilization of a relatively recent marketplace innovation, a form of AI technology, facial recognition. And so this is a technology that has been touted as a race neutral, gender neutral, and otherwise bias-free solution to making decisions or performing marketing tasks in an objective way. But we now know there is a major issue with such software, which is its inability to detect darker skinned tones. And more specifically, it has misidentified people of color as non-human, often as animals or objects. Also, AI algorithms tend to perform best on images of white men and worst on images of Black women. This happens because of the accuracy of facial recognition tools. It depends on the machine's ability to detect algorithms taught to it through the use of data sets curated by human engineers. And consequently, machine learning can perpetuate racial biases that exist in our society. So using CRT, we can acknowledge, further identify the source of, and correct such failures. First, CRT puts forward an active social justice agenda that in practice considers the pervasive role of structural racism and white privilege to understand the potential impact of AI technologies. It promotes a focus on eradicating racism by centering the experience of people of color as AI applications are considered and opposing the uncritical use of such tools. The interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches championed by CRT scholars and practitioners elevate interrelated policy, marketing, organizational, sociological, political, and historical dimensions of AI developments, including, and not limited to, how contemporary facial recognition technology is shaped by centuries of state-sanctioned surveillance activities targeting racialized people. And finally, an intersectional approach further identifies how overlapping categories of identity, such as race and gender, modulate individualized experiences when analyzing the effectiveness and impacts of AI tools. We are now starting to use the CRT lens in marketing to guide other marketplace studies, right? For example, in a separate paper, we demonstrate how CRT shows up in the faculty labor market. We use the centrality and permanence of race, racism in the intersection, which brings to light the oppressive roots in business faculty hiring policies, practices, norms, and traditions. We can see using this framework that if racism was merely isolated and unrelated incidences, we would expect greater variance in faculty hiring outcomes rather than stable inequities across institutions along racial and gender lines. And so this tenet brings to light the oppressive roots in those policies, practices, and norms in business school hiring in the paper. The challenge to dominant ideology reveals that race and race-related dynamics of hiring practice that purport to take a colorblind and merit-focused approach. This involves an interrogation of everyday, supposedly common sense hiring practices to reveal race or race dynamics which underlie so-called objective approaches. The value of experiential knowledge of people of color and understanding its relation to racial subordination shows up as an essential feature in this study. When we elevate the narratives of faculty of color who have served on search committees, and we counter power-laden beliefs and cast doubt on the majoritarian mindset that we are using this tenet. Intersectionality is helpful in identifying the ways that racism emerge in the experience of POCs on the job market. One example is the way that class dynamics appear in the affordances given to candidates that have degrees conferred for higher ranked schools, or degrees of freedom felt by faculty of different ranks for serving on search committees, right? This moves us beyond coded discourses that involve a deficit approach of blaming lack of diversity on the pipeline problem. And last, an overall commitment to social justice and ending racism serves for this study an action component for institutions, faculty hiring committees, and the researchers of the study. So what we did in this paper was a first step to demonstrating how CRT can support both broader and more nuanced understandings of the role of race and racism in the marketplace. Considering race through a framework of CRT can help us better understand consumers' lived experiences and better catalog and explain the role of race in marketing and consumption. Inequality, inequity, and racism are no doubt, challenges, right, in our society. Yet we do not view race as inherently problematic. Rather, we acknowledge the idealistic and liberatory aspects of race-related research. Critical race theory moves the focus beyond representational and involves the historical contextualization. And that shifts the focus of the research, the conversation of our practice from diversity and inclusion to equity and liberation. And so equity captured the notion that people get what they need versus everyone getting the same thing. And given the reality of differentially situated groups in society based on historical, social, and economic factors, the CRT focus on dissecting these realities for those often ignored or understudied can help marketers and marketing be a force for creating a more equitable society, and thus bring about greater well-being for all consumers across markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia and team. That's such amazing work. Before we get into the discussion, hopefully we can have a lively discussion about this really interesting work. I would like to introduce Tom Kinnear. Tom's going to make a few brief remarks on his kind of perspectives on the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing and the history of the Kinnear Award. I touched on some of this as I introduced the session. But just a brief introduction to Tom. Tom is the Eugene Applebaum Professor of Entrepreneurial Studies. He is founding editor of the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, has also served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Marketing. He is the past chair of the board of the American Marketing Association. Just such a distinguished scholar, and it has done so much for our field, and specifically this journal. So Tom, thank you so very much for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm sorry to be a few minutes late. We've had storms. We didn't have internet for 3 days, so I'm glad it came back today. And I'm lost. Enjoyed the paper. We'll talk more about that later. Just a few comments. The journal's 42 years old now. God, I must be old. Pat Murphy and I wrote a perspective on the journal that appeared in 21, if you want to look at it, Reflections on the 40th Birthday. And it goes through a sequence of topics and editorial approaches over the time. And the key out of that is it's a living organism. It becomes what is important in the day and what is really important in the day. And I went back and looked at the first, this award was first given by, a lot of people supported it, by the way, and in all non-humility, I let them put my name on it. The first award was given in '86. And in 1986, we were interested in things like the Federal Trade Commission and advertising outcomes that evolved over time to things like product searches, to tragedy of the common, entrepreneur, environmental issues, to nutrition, to food, to social justice a couple of years ago. And I think this paper today kind of puts a cherry on the top of an evolution that I think is really important for us to understand how it fits in the context of society and everything. So I salute you for that. It's for me, it's a great deal of fun to read all the papers and to see what's evolved and problems that have not been solved. Now, I've been around a long time, so I went back and looked at some of the old papers that were written in the 1970s about this issue. And would you believe the only topic that anybody cared about is whether including someone who was not white in an ad would cause a problem for the ad? Doesn't that seem terrifying? So I salute you. I salute where we've come. And I think this will stimulate a lot of continued research in this area and to take us to a better place as a intellectual group, as a journal, and as a society. And so I salute you. And I think the old timers should say something and then shut up and get out of the way. So let's have a good discussion. Thanks very much. I salute all the authors. I salute you.
Great, thank you, Tom. Next, as we start to enter our discussion portion of the session, I'd like to introduce Laura Paracchio. Laura is Emeritus Professor of Marketing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Laura was recently named MassSIG's 2023 Lifetime Achievement Award winner. She exemplifies the ideas of MassSIG, focusing her scholarship on critically important issues such as food access and well-being, materialism in youth, anti-smoking persuasion, nutrition information, vulnerable populations, scaling social impact, and building successful social movements. She has given countless hours as a servant leader, mentoring numerous PhD students and junior faculty into the marketing and public policy and TCR communities. We're so thankful to have Laura here to share her thoughts and moderate the discussion. Thank you for being here, Laura, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy, and congratulations to all of the authors of this extremely well-written, clear, cogent article that helps to present a conceptual paper that will hopefully lead to many, many more papers being published in marketing. Before I speak, I want to make sure that if any of the other co-authors, the paper co-authors, want to add something or say something, they can. Does anyone else want to add, make a comment? Sonia, Francesca, I know Akon, you're on here, Kevin, Lace, anybody? I'll take that as a no. Okay, all right. Then, and Sonia, your presentation was wonderful. It was really, really exceptionally well done. There were a number of things that I wanted to share that got touched on as the paper was introduced, and then Sonia talked about. And I know that if you do have a question, if you want to put it into the chat, or in a minute, we'll give a chance for people to open the open microphone if you prefer to do that. But I wanted to focus on a few pieces that I think are really key. And one is this idea that this is not a single article. And I think that the idea that this comes out of a whole stream of research, because one, it's very hard to change things, to move things with one paper, but it's the idea of being able to do a stream of research with a group, the Race in the Marketplace, the RIM group that works on this issue, and all of it focuses on creating change. But I do want to read something that was in the introduction to this article, and you all wrote, "The purpose of this article is to offer a path forward in which scholarship on race and marketplaces is no longer outsourced to social sciences and humanities colleagues." The idea that, and I was glad to hear when Martin said that this article didn't experience a rough review process. That's wonderful, and it's incredibly important, and as I said, well written, and I'm glad to hear that. But I think many of us here have experienced review processes where we've been asked, why is this marketing? Why should this appear in a marketing journal? And I think what this article does in making this statement and throughout is it's a call to action. It's not just a call to action to do research in this area. It's a call to action to all of us as editors and future editors, because I know there are future editors among us on this call today, as associate editors and as reviewers, that when we see articles, we make decisions that help move those articles forward so that they appear in our journals. When you look at, in the past, at editorials that had been written in our field by journal editors, they've talked about patrolling the fences, walking the fences, and they were using that as a metaphor for saying, this is marketing, this is consumer research, this is not. We need to build, and I think this article so clearly makes the case that we need to build bridges, not walls, that interdisciplinarity is absolutely key to really making contributions and making a difference and turning our research into something that can not only help our field, but help people and enhance both individual, collective, and societal well-being. As we look further, it also struck me, and I want to maybe switch here to a question, and I can come back to some comments to turn it back to use again, Sonia, that Martin talked about the fact that you had a non-academic stakeholder in your team as part of the writing team, as part of the TCR team. Can you speak to that as to how does that help to increase your ability to take ideas that appear on the pages of journals and then turn them into something that really has an impact into people's lives, that really helps to impact consumer practice? Can you speak to what was your experience working with a non-academic stakeholder? Why did you do that? Would you recommend other people do that?
Yes. Oh, first I want to say thank you for the kind words around your response to our paper. Yeah, I would say that, you know, the our non-academic contributor to the paper, Melinda, really provided us with sort of a different kind of perspective. Some, you know, we're all scholars, right? And we have certain jargon that we use and certain ways of doing things and certain ways of seeing things. And it was really to kind of like remove some of that, like sort of, you know, narrow vision around how to explain what was going on in a more like concrete, practical way. So I think that, you know, her contribution was key to helping us translate a lot of what we were sort of like, you know, grappling with and theorizing around into common sense language that could be used and applied in practice, right? And she does that work. She does that work every day. I don't know if any of my other co-authors would also like to jump in and answer that question.
I'll add that it was not only having a practitioner, I think having the multiple disciplines. I mean, we can think about marketing as interdisciplinary in and of itself, given that people come from different paradigms, but we also had a lawyer in the group, someone who studies criminology, whose PhD is in sociology and is a lawyer, who brought a vastly different set of perspectives in thinking about, you know, what's legal, what's allowed. A lot of the issues that we would talk about would come from around those perspectives as well. So I would say, in addition to the practice piece, the interdisciplinary piece is also important.
Anyone else want to add anything? Okay. I think as we look a little bit further, and maybe it helps here to just tell us for me to tell a little story. So I post books on Instagram. I have an Instagram at Professor Paracchio. I post books, and my daughter recently, one of my daughters, my youngest daughter, recently told me, Mom, you must stop posting books with the word change maker in the title of them. She said, you need to radicalize your thinking. You should be reading Black feminist scholarship, which you all cite some of that in the paper. If you were to design for us, I don't know, a reading list, something that you'd like us to do, what action would you like readers to take after they've read your paper? What do you want to happen? And it might be reading more, or it might be doing something.
Can I take this one?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think a lot of the appeal for joining this group was because of my past experiences during my doctoral program, in which I'm reading a bunch of papers and I just kept saying, who is this? Who does this? Right? And so in terms of like an action step, I would challenge people to reread some of those traditional papers and look at it, like challenge them to look at it from a CRT perspective. Because what I was seeing back 10 years ago, right, based on my own experience, people weren't necessarily seeing that. Clearly, reviewers weren't seeing it because of the pushback that I was getting when I would try to submit work. So I would challenge people to go back to those papers and use that as a way to see if they can find it themselves, right? And really pinpoint and say, this is what they're talking about. I can see it now. I think that would definitely help.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. So to look at the familiar, these articles that we've read again and again, and see them with new eyes, see them through a new lens, see them all in a new way. Anyone else?
I would add something to that, and I think that's fantastic. I Appreciate that. I think another thing that will be helpful, a big part of the paper is to look at to do the reflexive work of understanding your own positionality and understanding what you're bringing to your research. And so what I think we would ask folks to do is really understand, what are my blind spots? How have I perpetuated that traditional approach, and how can I now move closer to that transformative CRT approach? And so we have really, how have I been quote unquote objective in my work, and how has that maybe hampered my work? And how might I actually move toward more of a social justice lens? And how might that deepen my work and understanding of, based on my positionality, whether it be looking at your race, gender, sexuality, how can that be a benefit in my work versus something that I need to hide in my work?
Thank you, Kevin. Anyone else? Do we have any questions from the, oh, did I cut somebody off? Martin, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm thinking about this paper as what I mentioned earlier, right? I have like a wish list of papers I feel I must read in my doctoral seminar, and I teach the first doctoral seminar with our fresh students. I wonder what the team's advice is, because I feel like a stream of research really lasts once we add to the conceptual perspective the empirical perspective. And I'm aware of empirical research on race in the marketplace. I feel it should and could grow further. What is your advice on how we train students to get to empirical research on critical race theory in the marketplace? What are methods? What are data sources? What are ideas you have and advice you have for the next generation of marketing scholars who hopefully understand that the topic is important, and now we move to the question of how do we best study it empirically?
I've got some initial thoughts. I think one starting point is even getting people to think critically about the conceptual empirical binary opposition that's sometimes assumed to be at play. So I'm conscious when we're dealing with research such as this, I'm particularly thinking about the role of reflexivity in relation to that, and how who is doing this sort of research can impact perceptions of it or critiques of it or interpretations of it. I think a starting point in relation to pedagogy is encouraging students to reflect on knowledge from lived experience and thinking about empirical work and conceptualizing as being very much interconnected. So one way that can maybe be facilitated is thinking critically about the concept of data itself. And is data something that is sort of constructed or collected? And depending on your perspective on that, what does that then maybe tell us about ideas in relation to knowledge, race, power, and how we can encourage students to understand or embrace research and scholarly work as something that's in the everyday and exists beyond the confines of a classroom or an institutional setting.
I think something for me, I took a course in sociology, research methods in sociology. And it was something very simple that, it helped to understand how to do some of that reflexive work. And it was a simple assignment around observation, like literally go to Starbucks and for an hour, you have to write your observations. And the things that you record, right, the things that you're writing down kind of tell you what you're looking at. It tells a story. Right? It tells a story about what's important, what's not important to you. And then when you exchange that with someone else, what is it that they pick up on? What questions do they have? And to help with the critical piece, right? Then we start bringing in these exercises around, well, who gets to be this? Who has this power? How does that look? What would happen if it were the other way around? I think that's I think that exercise was one of the most powerful ways of kind of introducing this idea without it being so, what's the word? So far-fetched. I guess that's more what I'm thinking at.
Thank you, Akon.
If I can add so just a few words. I am someone who joined the team when I was a PhD student. And while I was not trained necessarily and race-related issues, I do encourage for those that have PhD students to really join the Race in the Marketplace community and sort of learn from so many wonderful papers and so many wonderful scholars who are very generous with their time and can have created a space to really embrace people who want to do more of this work. So they reaching out to those who have been doing this for a long time and recognizing their work and spending the time to get to do a lot of this work that doesn't always get published. And some of the premier journals also helps with, so in the long term, to get familiar with methods, to get familiar with the type of data that they use, and eventually, leading to a publication. But more than everything, to remain part of a community that is learning, that is growing, and it's supporting each other.
Thank you. I know we're almost out of time, but I want to circle back to Sonia Poole and ask for kind of final thoughts or summarize a summary of what do you want to leave us with?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I would love for people to leave here with is the notion that, yes, this is a call to action paper. And I do feel that we are behind, right? Marketing research, marketing scholars. I mean, folks are doing this kind of work in other fields. And, we're probably, 20, 25 years behind other fields of education, public health. I know that, Sonia actually left the marketing field for a while to join public health domain, because that was an area where this kind of framework was sort of taken for granted. I mean, we just this is what we know already, right? And we're not there in marketing, we're not there in our scholarship. And so my hope is, and I think, speaking for all of the authors of the paper, our hope is to, encourage other work in this field. And we've already sort of suggested ways in which this can be done, the supports that need to be in place in order for this to happen. And I just also want to thank the reviewers of the paper and Martin and Mara, who have pushed us to continue to do the work that we were doing, because had we not had that kind of encouragement on that end, this paper would not see the light of day. And so we also need more people on that side of the process to push these things through. So yeah, my final thought is to continue the good work, and we hope that this paper inspires people to do more.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I just said congratulations. I'm sure it will. Absolutely.
May I add an invitation to what Sonia just said? We need more work of this. And on behalf of TCR, I would like to invite those of you who are at Summer AMA. This coming Friday, we have a 4-hour workshop at Summer AMA from 12 to 4 p.m. And we have one specific dedicated section of this workshop on the SDGs and DEI in marketing, because I feel we are behind. I agree with that. And we have Samantha Crosscom to pitch a dialogical section of our workshop, specifically with the idea of DEI and race and its role in marketing. So those of you who are there, I heartfelt invite you to join us. It's a small group. I hope to have like 15 or 20 people, but the more the merrier. And anyone who's interested in the intersection between SDGs and marketing and the role of race, I hope to see you there on Friday. Thank you.
Can I add one thing? I just wanted to add to what Sonia said, the whole notion of, something that we can do is the more we learn individually, the more we can support others in the field, the more we will have better reviewers. I mean, Martin mentioned the process of our paper going through, but that's built on 10 people who've had cumulative experience with these reviews and lots of rejections and lots of drama in that review process. We were able to bring and learn from it in this process. But moving forward, as we talk about increasing the amount of work, making the work more relevant to practitioners, we have to be able to support people who do this work, whether we do it ourselves or not. So I would hope that the more we learn about change making, that we think about how it applies to race as well, and that we can then be good reviewers, whether we do that work or not. We can then support our colleagues who do this work and make suggestions to them and find other ways to support students as well.
Thank you. Back to you, Beth.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks to everyone for being here. Tom, Martin, and Laura, thanks for sharing your perspectives, and especially to the author team. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. We're grateful that you wrote this paper, and we're grateful that you shared it with us today. Sonia, thanks for being an amazing representative of your team and telling the story behind your paper. Thanks for bringing this to marketing and creating a platform for scholars to build on this work. I am very proud that this is published in JPP&M and considered JPP&M a home for this type of work. So please consider it an outlet for this type of research. It is most welcome. Thank you again to everyone. Have a wonderful day, and hope to see you in some more virtual sessions or later this week in San Francisco.
Congrats. See you soon.
Congrats, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.